welcome back. This is Something's Happening here, and today is Wednesday if you're watching this when it is released. So before we get started, as always, subscribe. And the way to do that is different on each platform, so I can't tell you how to do it on your platform, but on whatever platform you're watching this on, there is a way to keep those notifications coming, and if you don't know what that way is, I'll tell you what. Drop a comment under this video and someone will tell you, or we'll figure out a way to tell you. So we don't want you to miss a single piece of this. Probably we have been doing this already, but this is the first time I'm mentioning it. We're going to try to get in the habit of putting the articles that I reference in each segment in the comment section below where you're watching the video, so you can do further research on your own if that is what you choose to do. So again, I'm Steve Hicks, and I'm the Director of Podcast Ministries for Talking Donkey International, and we are talking about the return of Jesus Christ this week and the things in the world that he said to look out for as that day approaches. The episode is called The End of the World as We Know It. Today, we are looking at food because the Lord tells us, again in Matthew 24, this is such a profound chapter that we find so much information on this topic in this one place. But in this chapter, in verse 7, Jesus gives us a number of signs to look out for. And he says this: "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and other things too, pestilences and earthquakes in various places." And so it's the famines that we're going to talk about today. That's why we're talking about food. We're living in a moment in time where food insecurity is a phrase that we probably have to have in our vocabulary. And I'm going to illustrate that first with the Washington Post. This is an article from March of 2022, so it's actually almost a year old now. It's called "All That's Stopping a Full-Blown Food Crisis? Rice." And so, here is the explanation. Crises are often years in the making. Oh, wait, no. And then it goes through some history of various crises. At the end of that paragraph, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has upended one of the world's most important bread baskets, pushing the cost of wheat to an all-time high. Vegetable oil and corn prices are also surging. Food importing nations are understandably worried. Thankfully, there's enough rice this time around for prices to remain subdued. So in other words, there are kind of food staples like wheat and corn and vegetable oil that are suddenly scarce. They're in short supply because of this war in Ukraine. And there are other kind of geopolitical factors as well. The supply chain issues still lingering from COVID and the pandemic lockdowns and all that stuff. I mean, this is a complex issue, but the bottom line is the global food supply is lesser now than it has been in years past. And life is not a video game, so we're not waiting for food to fall out of the sky. That's not how real life works. This is a problem. When there's not enough food, people don't eat. Washington Post continues by saying, "Rice matters because it's the staple diet for half the world's population, including about 1 billion undernourished people living in Asia and West Africa." So, long story short, Washington Post is telling us that absent of rice kind of being the foundation of the food supply system for lots and lots and lots of people, a full 7th or 8th of the world's population relies on this. Because that is abundant enough, therefore, this food crisis will be mitigated. But is that the end of the story? No, of course not. Because when we jump ahead just a few months to October of 2022, and we check out this article by Grow Intelligence. So this is it's an agriculturally based organization here. And this article is called "World Rice Production to Drop in 2022/23, Reversing Years of Bounty." So we've got, on the one hand, Washington Post says, yeah, things are pretty bad, but as long as there's enough rice, we'll be okay. And then a few months later, the food people show up and say, by the way, there's not going to be enough rice pretty soon. Yikes. I mean, that's a crisis, right? That's a real problem. From this article, worldwide rice production for 2022-23 will shrink for the first time in 3 years after extreme weather events from China to South Asia and California damaged harvests. The production decline represents a reversal after consecutive years of bigger rice crops. So this is really a problem. Now, tightening supplies of rice, the world's number 3 most cultivated grain, could add upward pressure on rice supplies and threaten to accelerate food insecurity and food price inflation in many countries. So there you go. I mean, this is a slow rolling, although faster rolling like an avalanche, crisis for millions of people, hundreds of millions of people. Maybe even more than a billion. This is a crisis of, dare I say, biblical proportions. It may not seem that way in the United States because we kind of insulate ourselves against a lot of this stuff by being such a bountiful and productive economy in and of ourselves. But you know that all of planet Earth is not the United States, right? So just because we are doing all right here does not mean everybody's doing all right. And people are going hungry, and this is a mess. So Jesus said this would happen. He said it in the context of all these things must happen, but let your heart not be troubled because the end is not yet. But it's hard to not let your heart be troubled when your stomach is quite troubled, right? When it's empty and it's growling at you, almost nothing else really matters. Why, again, would this be one of the things that Jesus ordains to happen prior to his return? Where could possibly be the redemptive or judgment value in this? What do you think? Well, I've got 2 answers. The first takes place deep in the past, and the second takes place not too far in the future. But let's start deep in the past, okay? If you would join me in your Bibles, way back in the book of Genesis. So, like Revelation is the last one in the Bible, Genesis is the first one in the Bible. It's really hard to not be able to find that one. We're going to Genesis chapter 3. Because I think we're going to discover that food has been a problem for people since the very beginning. All right. You may or may not know the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. You may or may not believe the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. I am here to tell you that I know it and I believe it. I believe it is a historical record written by Moses, inspired by God, to let us know how God created life in the planet and how things ultimately came to be the way that they are. If you are not, I recognize that not all believers feel that way, and certainly outside of Christianity, I would be hard-pressed to find anybody who believes that way, because if they did, they'd be Christians. But I'm just acknowledging that your belief system might not be the same as mine on what I'm about to share. But stick with us anyway here, because even if you don't believe it to be literal truth like I do, you can still get principles of truth from it, okay? And so that's where we're aiming for today. Genesis chapter 3 tells the story of the first man and the first woman and how they fell from the kind of perfected grace in which they were created to the sinful state in which we all live now. And the story ultimately happens because of a piece of food. In chapter 2, before sin, the Lord gave one command to Adam in verse 16. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, "Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." He says, the whole world is yours, except for this one thing. Just don't eat from this one thing. So, of course, that's what the devil shows up to try to convince them to eat. The devil always goes after the weakness. Always, always, always. If you have a weakness, I guarantee you the devil will exploit it. That's what he's good at. So the devil shows up in the form of a serpent, and he questions Eve on this restriction. In verse 2 and 3, she answers and says, "We may eat the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die." So here comes the devil's lie to mess her up. Verse 4, "Then the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die." And last week we talked about that lie, right? Where God says, no, death is final. And the devil shows up and says, nah, don't even worry about it. You just kind of change form a little bit, right? And so we explored that all of last week in our episode called Anybody Seen a Ghost? But the devil goes on in verse 5. He says, "For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Right? So he's enticing her. You're going to get something by disobeying God. By eating this food you're not supposed to eat, you will gain something. So now verse 6 gives Eve's rationale for disobeying. It says, "When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate." Right? So that's the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, to borrow language from the New Testament. And the devil just used all three of those things to go after Eve where she was vulnerable, in her stomach. And ever since this problem in Genesis 3, humanity has had a problem with food. Do you remember the global health crisis of a few years ago? I know the media tried to make us all believe that we were all equally susceptible to this thing, and we all shared the exact same risk factors, whether we were, 2 months old or 95 years old. But scientifically, that's just not true. And there were some major factors that would dramatically increase one's risk of severe illness or death from that virus. And age was number one. I mean, unquestionably, the older you got, the more danger you were in. But weight was like the number 2 factor. Obesity, overweight. And so when we started getting real science about you would pass away from the virus, but also you probably had 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 comorbidities with that, those comorbidities are almost always weight related. And I'm not saying this to shame or judge. I'm just kind of relaying truth, right? We just went through a global health crisis that was exacerbated by the fact that so many people are unhealthy. That this problem humanity has with food is no lessened now in the 21st century as it was way back then in the Garden of Eden. And so when Christ returns, this is a matter of judgment. This has been a problem for us since the very, very beginning. And so Jesus is the answer to that problem. I mean, Jesus is the answer to all problems. I firmly believe that. I don't think he shows up to give answers. I think he is the answer. So wherever he goes, the answer is there. So we're looking for how to solve this food problem in our lives. Therefore, does it surprise us that Jesus says, "I am the bread of life"? He says it in John chapter 6, verse 48, and I'm pretty sure he says it another time in that same chapter as well. I am the bread of life. Eve wanted greater life than she already had, so she's going after all the forbidden fruit the devil tells her to eat. We want foods that we shouldn't have, left and right, all the time, all day long. Most everything you go to the grocery store and buy is you'd never find it in nature. It comes out of a factory or it is processed or whatever. This is a problem for us, and Jesus says, you know what the answer is? Me. You want food that satisfies? Guess what? I am the bread of life. And in Revelation chapter 19, verses 1 through 10, we see that the redeemed, after Christ returns, are invited to a supper. That's the imagery we get, the marriage supper of the Lamb. So we get to rejoice with divine food because we were able to overcome the problem of earthly food that has plagued us from the very beginning. So, all of that is to say, we've got a food crisis that's happening right now, and it may or may not hurt depending on where you are living, or the extent to which it hurts will vary depending on where you're living. But Jesus is the answer to all of these problems, and he is coming soon to deliver us to a land where hunger will be a word we never have to use ever again. And so, come back tomorrow as we kind of round out this argument about the soon return of Jesus Christ. And I look forward to seeing you again at that time. I'm Steve Hicks. This is Something's Happening Here, and I'll see you tomorrow. God bless you.